Welcome to History for Snooze. Every page of history carries not only the stories of how people lived, but also how they said goodbye. In the Middle Ages, death was not hidden. It was a part of daily life, woven into faith, ritual, and the deep silence of farewell. Tonight, we drift into that world of medieval funerals. From the solemn tolling of church bells to the slow processions through village streets, each ritual reflected both sorrow and hope. Candles flickered beside wooden coffins, prayers rose into the air, and mourners dressed in black walked together, carrying the weight of grief and the comfort of tradition. Some funerals were simple, marked only by quiet earth and whispered blessings, while others were grand, filled with chants, incense, and solemn ceremony. In every case, the passage from life to death was seen not as an ending, but as a journey of the soul, guided by faith toward eternity. So, as you listen, picture the hush of a medieval church, the scent of wax and incense, and the soft footsteps of mourners on stone floors. Imagine the stillness of a moment when life paused, and the living honored the dead. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your small support keeps these gentle journeys alive. And in the comments, let me know where in the world you're listening from. It always warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. Now, close your eyes, and let us wander together through the history of medieval funerals, where sorrow, faith, and remembrance shaped the final chapter of life. Death in medieval Europe was not merely a biological event but a profound social, religious, and cultural phenomenon that shaped the very fabric of society. From approximately 500 to 1500 CE, funeral practices evolved dramatically, influenced by Christianity's spread, social hierarchies, economic conditions, and changing theological understanding of the afterlife. This comprehensive examination explores how medieval communities confronted mortality, honored their dead, and constructed meaning around the universal human experience of death. Medieval funeral history reveals a complex tapestry woven from pre-Christian traditions, evolving Christian doctrine, social stratification, and practical necessities. The way societies buried their dead reflected their deepest beliefs about life, death, salvation, and social order. From simple peasant burials in unmarked graves to elaborate royal funeral processions that lasted for weeks, medieval funeral practices encompassed an extraordinary range of customs, rituals, and beliefs. The medieval period witnessed the transformation of death from a primarily familial and community concern in the early Middle Ages to an increasingly institutionalized and church-controlled affair by the later medieval period. This evolution paralleled broader changes in medieval society, including the rise of towns, the development of sophisticated religious institutions, the emergence of professional guilds, and the growth of a money economy that allowed for more elaborate funeral arrangements. Understanding medieval funeral practices requires examining multiple interconnected elements: the theological framework that gave meaning to death and the afterlife, the social structures that determined who received what type of burial, the economic factors that influenced funeral arrangements, the material culture surrounding death and burial, and the emotional and psychological dimensions of grief and mourning. Each of these elements evolved throughout the medieval period, creating a rich and varied landscape of death-related customs. Pre-Christian influences and syncretism. The early medieval period inherited a complex legacy of funeral practices from both the classical world and various Germanic, Celtic, and other European tribal traditions. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, it encountered well-established death customs that had deep cultural significance. Rather than completely replacing these traditions, early Christian leaders often adapted and reinterpreted them within a Christian framework, creating a syncretic approach that would characterize medieval funeral practices for centuries. Germanic tribes, who played a crucial role in shaping early medieval Europe, brought sophisticated burial customs that emphasized social status, warrior culture, and beliefs about the afterlife journey. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe reveals elaborate grave goods, including weapons, jewelry, and everyday objects intended to accompany the deceased into the next world. The famous Sutton Hoo burial in Anglo-Saxon England exemplifies these practices, with its ship burial containing magnificent treasures that spoke to both the deceased's earthly power and beliefs about the afterlife. Celtic traditions contributed their own distinctive elements, particularly the concept of thin boundaries between the world of the living and the dead. Celtic funeral customs often involved elaborate rituals designed to ensure the deceased's peaceful transition and to maintain ongoing relationships between the living and dead. These beliefs would later influence medieval Christian concepts about saints, intercession, and the communion of saints. Roman funeral practices provided another important foundation, particularly in areas where Roman civilization had been well established. Roman customs included elaborate funeral processions, cremation followed later by inhumation, and the maintenance of family tombs where regular memorial meals and rituals occurred. The Roman emphasis on memorializing the dead through inscriptions, monuments, and ongoing rituals would significantly influence medieval Christian funeral practices. Early Christian adaptations. Early Christian leaders faced the challenge of creating distinctly Christian funeral practices while accommodating existing cultural traditions. The Christian emphasis on bodily resurrection created a strong preference for burial over cremation, which had been common in many pre-Christian traditions. This theological principle would become one of the most enduring characteristics of medieval funeral practices. The development of Christian cemeteries marked a significant departure from earlier practices. Rather than burying the dead along roadsides or in family plots, Christians began creating communal burial grounds, often associated with churches or martyrs' shrines. This shift reflected Christian beliefs about community, equality in death, and the importance of sacred space in preparing for resurrection. Early Christian funeral rituals emphasized simplicity and spiritual preparation rather than earthly display. Church fathers like John Chrysostom and Augustine advocated for modest funerals that reflected Christian values of humility and focus on eternal rather than temporal concerns. However, even in these early centuries, social distinctions began to appear in Christian burial practices, particularly regarding burial location within or near churches. The cult of martyrs profoundly influenced early medieval funeral practices. Burial ad sanctos, near the saints, became highly desirable, leading to the development of cemetery hierarchies based on proximity to holy relics or saints' tombs. This practice established a precedent for the elaborate systems of burial privilege that would characterize later medieval funeral culture. Liturgical development. The early medieval period saw the gradual development of standardized funeral liturgy. Initial Christian funeral practices were relatively simple, focusing on prayers for the deceased and readings from Scripture. However, as Christianity became more institutionalized, formal funeral rites emerged that would provide the foundation for medieval funeral liturgy. The Roman liturgical tradition, codified during the pontificate of Gregory the Great, 590 to 604, established many elements that would remain central to medieval funeral practices. The Gregorian funeral liturgy included specific prayers, chants, and ritual actions designed to commend the soul to God and provide comfort to the bereaved. These liturgical elements were gradually adopted throughout medieval Europe, though regional variations persisted. Theological developments and purgatory. The high medieval period witnessed profound theological developments that revolutionized Christian understanding of death and the afterlife. The most significant of these was the elaboration of the doctrine of purgatory, which fundamentally altered funeral practices and death-related customs throughout medieval Europe. Prior to the high medieval period, Christian theology generally recognized two main post-mortem destinations: heaven for the saved and hell for the damned. However, theological reflection on the fate of souls who died in God's grace but still bore the temporal punishment for sin led to the development of purgatory as an intermediate state. This theological innovation had enormous practical implications for funeral practices. The doctrine of purgatory created new possibilities for the living to assist the dead through prayers, masses, and good works. This belief system transformed funerals from primarily commemorative events into active interventions on behalf of the deceased's eternal welfare. The practice of offering masses for the dead became increasingly elaborate and systematic, with families and institutions establishing endowments to ensure ongoing spiritual assistance for deceased relatives. Peter Lombard's sentences, compiled in the mid-12th century, provided systematic theological framework for understanding purgatory and its implications for funeral practices. His work influenced generations of medieval theologians and helped establish the doctrinal foundations for the elaborate funeral and memorial customs that characterized the later medieval period. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, further developed official church teaching on purgatory and related practices. The Council's emphasis on the efficacy of prayer and good works for the dead provided ecclesiastical sanction for increasingly elaborate funeral arrangements and ongoing memorial practices. Social stratification and funeral display. The high medieval period saw the emergence of more complex social hierarchies that were reflected in increasingly elaborate funeral distinctions. The development of feudalism created clear social categories: nobility, clergy, merchants, artisans, and peasants, each with distinctive funeral customs that reinforced social boundaries even in death. Noble funerals became spectacular displays of power, wealth, and social status. These elaborate ceremonies served multiple functions: honoring the deceased, displaying family wealth and power, reinforcing social hierarchies, and providing public entertainment. Noble funeral processions could involve hundreds of participants, including professional mourners, musicians, clergy, and representatives from various social groups. The practice of lying in state became common for high-ranking nobles and clergy, allowing for extended public viewing and mourning. These arrangements required sophisticated logistics, including body preservation techniques, elaborate decorations, and coordinated ceremonies that could last for days or weeks. Heraldic displays became increasingly important in noble funerals, with family coats of arms, banners, and symbolic objects used to proclaim the deceased's lineage, achievements, and social position. These heraldic elements transformed funerals into complex symbolic performances that communicated detailed information about family history, political alliances, and social status. The development of tomb sculpture during this period reflected similar concerns with status and memorialization. Elaborate stone effigies, often depicting the deceased in full regalia, became important markers of social distinction and family pride. These monuments served as permanent reminders of the deceased's earthly importance and provided focal points for ongoing memorial activities. Urban development and cemetery changes. The growth of medieval towns and cities created new challenges and opportunities for funeral practices. Urban development required more systematic approaches to burial, leading to the establishment of organized cemeteries, professional funeral services, and standardized procedures for handling death in densely populated areas. Urban cemeteries often developed in relation to parish churches, creating a network of burial grounds throughout medieval cities. These parish cemeteries served local communities and reflected neighborhood social structures, with burial locations within each cemetery indicating relative social status and family prominence. The development of confraternities and guilds created new forms of collective funeral arrangements. These organizations provided mutual support for members' families, ensuring proper funeral arrangements even for those of modest means. Guild funerals became important community events that reinforced professional identities and social bonds. Urban funeral practices also reflected the increasing commercialization of medieval society. Professional funeral directors, monument makers, and other specialists emerged to serve the growing demand for elaborate funeral arrangements. This commercialization allowed for more sophisticated funeral displays but also created new forms of social competition and display. The emergence of hospital and charitable institutions in medieval cities provided new approaches to caring for the dying and burying the poor. These institutions developed systematic procedures for handling death and burial, contributing to the rationalization of funeral practices in urban settings. Monastic and clerical funeral traditions. Medieval monasteries developed distinctive funeral traditions that reflected their spiritual values and communal structure. Monastic funerals emphasized simplicity, community solidarity, and focus on eternal rather than temporal concerns. However, even within monastic communities, certain distinctions emerged based on ecclesiastical rank and spiritual achievement. The monastic emphasis on memento mori, remember death, created a culture where death was constantly present in daily life. Monastic communities developed elaborate rituals around dying, including special prayers for the dying, community presence during the death process, and systematic memorial practices for deceased community members. Monastic funeral practices included unique elements such as the commendatio anime, commendation of the soul, special chants and prayers, and the practice of burying monks in simple shrouds rather than elaborate clothing. These practices emphasized spiritual equality and the temporary nature of earthly distinctions. The development of obituary books in monastic communities provided systematic approaches to memorial commemoration. These books listed deceased community members and specified the prayers and masses to be offered for their souls, creating an ongoing cycle of memorial activity that could continue for centuries. Clerical funerals, particularly for bishops and abbots, combined monastic simplicity with recognition of ecclesiastical authority. These funerals often involved elaborate liturgical ceremonies that demonstrated both the individual's spiritual achievement and the institutional power of the church. Grave goods and personal items. The material culture of medieval funerals reveals complex attitudes toward the relationship between earthly possessions and spiritual salvation. While Christian theology emphasized the temporary nature of worldly goods, funeral practices throughout the medieval period continued to include various objects buried with or dedicated to the deceased. Early medieval burials often included personal items that reflected both Christian beliefs and older cultural traditions. Religious objects such as crosses, pilgrim badges, and prayer beads became common grave goods, reflecting the deceased's faith and hoped-for spiritual protection. These Christian objects often appeared alongside more traditional items such as jewelry, tools, or personal ornaments. The practice of burying objects with the deceased varied significantly based on social class, regional traditions, and historical period. While elaborate grave goods became less common as Christian doctrine emphasized spiritual over material concerns, Certain items remained important markers of identity and status throughout the medieval period. Pilgrim badges and religious medallions found in medieval graves reveal the importance of pilgrimage and devotional practices in medieval Christianity. These objects served as permanent testimony to the deceased's spiritual journeys and religious commitments, providing evidence of personal piety that extended beyond death. The inclusion of coins in medieval burials, sometimes called Karen's obol, after the classical practice of paying the ferryman to cross the river Styx, demonstrated the persistence of pre-Christian customs within Christian funeral practices. These coins sometimes bore Christian symbols or inscriptions, reflecting the syncretic nature of medieval death culture. Funeral clothing and textiles. Medieval funeral clothing served multiple symbolic and practical functions, communicating information about the deceased's social status, religious devotion, and family identity. The choice of funeral attire became increasingly important as medieval society developed more complex social hierarchies and elaborate funeral customs. Noble funeral clothing often included elaborate textiles, furs, and jewelry that demonstrated the family's wealth and social position. These garments were frequently specifically commissioned for funeral use and might include heraldic elements, expensive fabrics, and precious decorations that would be visible during the funeral procession and burial ceremony. Religious funeral clothing reflected different concerns, emphasizing spiritual rather than temporal status. Monks and nuns were typically buried in their religious habits, symbolizing their commitment to spiritual life and their identity within religious communities. Clergy were often buried in liturgical vestments appropriate to their ecclesiastical rank, reflecting their role in the church hierarchy. The development of specialized funeral clothing for different social groups created a complex system of visual communication about the deceased's identity and status. Sumptuary laws sometimes regulated funeral clothing, attempting to prevent excessive display or inappropriate status claims through funeral attire. Shrouds and burial wrappings varied significantly based on social status and regional customs. While simple linen shrouds were common for ordinary burials, elaborate textiles might be used for higher status individuals. The quality and decoration of shrouds became another marker of social distinction in medieval funeral practices. Memorial objects and monuments. The creation of permanent memorial objects became increasingly important throughout the medieval period, reflecting desires to preserve the memory of the deceased and provide focal points for ongoing memorial activities. These objects ranged from simple grave markers to elaborate architectural monuments that demonstrated family wealth and artistic patronage. Tomb sculpture emerged as one of the most important forms of medieval memorial art, with skilled craftsmen creating increasingly sophisticated representations of the deceased. Early medieval tomb sculpture was relatively simple, but by the high medieval period, elaborate effigies became common for high-status individuals, depicting them in full regalia and often including detailed symbolic elements. The development of brass memorial tablets provided a less expensive alternative to stone sculpture while still allowing for detailed commemorative inscriptions and decorative elements. These brass memorials often included heraldic devices, religious symbols, and lengthy inscriptions celebrating the deceased's achievements and requesting prayers for their soul. Stained glass windows commissioned as memorial objects became another important form of medieval commemoration. These windows often depicted the deceased in prayer, surrounded by saints or religious scenes, and included inscriptions requesting ongoing prayers. Memorial windows served the dual function of beautifying church interiors while providing permanent reminders of the deceased's piety and family generosity. The practice of commissioning memorial manuscripts, particularly books of hours or psalters, created portable memorial objects that could be used in ongoing devotional activities. These manuscripts often included special prayers for the deceased, memorial portraits, and heraldic decorations that celebrated family identity while serving practical devotional purposes. Northern European traditions. The funeral practices of Northern Europe, encompassing modern-day Scandinavia, Germany, and the British Isles, retained distinctive characteristics that reflected both pre-Christian traditions and unique adaptations of Christian practice. These regions' funeral customs were shaped by harsh climates, warrior cultures, and strong tribal identities that persisted well into the Christian period. Scandinavian funeral practices maintained strong connections to pre-Christian traditions, particularly the emphasis on warrior culture and the journey to the afterlife. Even after Christianization, Scandinavian funerals often retained elements of earlier customs, including the inclusion of weapons, ships, and other objects associated with the deceased's earthly role and status. The practice of ship burial, while becoming less common after Christianization, influenced Scandinavian church architecture and funeral symbolism. Many Scandinavian churches incorporated ship-like architectural elements, and funeral processions sometimes included symbolic references to the soul's journey across water to the afterlife. Germanic funeral traditions emphasized the importance of family honor and social status, leading to elaborate displays of wealth and power in funeral ceremonies. German noble funerals became particularly elaborate affairs, with complex processions, heraldic displays, and ceremonies that could last for extended periods. Anglo-Saxon England developed distinctive funeral practices that combined Germanic traditions with Roman and Celtic influences. The gradual Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England created a complex mixture of funeral customs that reflected multiple cultural sources while adapting to Christian theological requirements. The development of Anglo-Saxon funeral poetry, including elegies such as The Wanderer and The Seafarer, reveals sophisticated attitudes toward death, memory, and the relationship between earthly and eternal concerns. These literary works provide important insights into Anglo-Saxon funeral culture and its emotional dimensions. Mediterranean and Southern European practices. The funeral practices of Southern Europe, particularly in regions that had been thoroughly Romanized, retained stronger connections to classical traditions while adapting to Christian requirements. The warmer climate of these regions also created different practical requirements for funeral arrangements and burial practices. Italian funeral practices were heavily influenced by the proximity to Rome and the papal court. Italian cities developed particularly elaborate funeral customs, with wealthy families commissioning impressive funeral processions, temporary decorations, and permanent monuments that demonstrated both piety and social status. The development of Renaissance humanism in late medieval Italy created new approaches to death and commemoration that emphasized individual achievement and artistic expression. Italian funeral monuments became increasingly elaborate and personalized, reflecting humanist values alongside traditional Christian concerns. Spanish funeral practices reflected the complex cultural mixture of Christian, Islamic, and Jewish influences that characterized medieval Iberia. The long period of religious coexistence and conflict in Spain created unique funeral traditions that adapted to changing political and religious circumstances. The Spanish emphasis on family honor and social status created elaborate funeral customs that served to reinforce social hierarchies and demonstrate family wealth and power. Spanish noble funerals became spectacular public events that involved entire communities and could continue for extended periods. French funeral practices evolved within the context of growing royal power and increasing social stratification. French royal funerals became models for elaborate ceremonial display that influenced funeral customs throughout Europe. The development of French court culture created sophisticated funeral rituals that combined religious ceremony with political theater. Eastern European and Byzantine influences. Eastern European funeral practices were significantly influenced by Byzantine Christianity, which maintained different theological emphases and liturgical traditions from Western Christianity. The Eastern Orthodox approach to death and funeral practices created distinctive customs that reflected different theological priorities and cultural values. Byzantine funeral liturgy emphasized the resurrection and the continuity between earthly and eternal life in ways that differed from Western Christian practices. The Byzantine funeral service included elaborate chants, incense ceremonies, and symbolic actions that created a distinctive aesthetic and spiritual atmosphere. The Eastern Orthodox emphasis on icons and religious imagery influenced funeral practices throughout Eastern Europe, with icon processions, religious paintings, and symbolic decorations playing important roles in funeral ceremonies. The use of religious imagery created visually rich funeral environments that served both devotional and commemorative purposes. Slavic funeral traditions retained elements of pre-Christian customs while adapting to Orthodox Christian requirements. The strong emphasis on community solidarity in Slavic cultures created funeral practices that involved entire villages and emphasized collective mourning and support for bereaved families. The practice of elaborate funeral feasting in Eastern European cultures reflected both pre-Christian traditions and Christian concepts of community solidarity. These feasts served multiple functions, honoring the deceased, providing community support for bereaved families, and reinforcing social bonds within local communities. Economic aspects of medieval funerals. Cost and social access. The economic dimensions of medieval funeral practices reveal significant information about social stratification, family priorities, and the commercialization of death-related services. The cost of funeral arrangements varied enormously based on social status, regional customs, and personal preferences, creating complex systems of funeral economics that reflected broader medieval economic structures. Peasant funerals typically involved minimal monetary expenditure, relying instead on community labor, family resources, and simple materials. However, even modest funeral arrangements required economic sacrifices that could strain family resources, particularly during periods of economic hardship or poor harvests. The cost of clergy participation in funeral ceremonies represented one of the most significant expenses for medieval families. The fees charged for funeral masses, prayers, and other religious services created a system where the extent of spiritual assistance available to the deceased depended largely on the family's economic resources. Urban funeral practices created new economic opportunities and challenges, with professional funeral services emerging to serve growing city populations. These services included professional mourners, musicians, cemetery workers, and various craftsmen who specialized in funeral-related goods and services. The development of funeral insurance through guilds and confraternities provided new approaches to managing funeral costs, allowing members to pool resources and ensure proper burial arrangements for all members regardless of individual economic circumstances. These collective arrangements reflected medieval values of community solidarity while addressing practical economic concerns. The practice of funeral charity, where wealthy individuals or institutions provided funeral assistance to the poor, created complex relationships between economic status and funeral arrangements. These charitable practices served both religious and social functions, allowing the wealthy to demonstrate piety while ensuring that even the poor received proper Christian burial. Professional funeral services. The medieval period witnessed the gradual development of professional funeral services, as the increasing complexity of funeral arrangements required specialized knowledge and skills. These professional services emerged first in urban areas and gradually spread to smaller communities as demand for more elaborate funeral arrangements increased. Professional mourners became common in many medieval communities, providing standardized emotional expression and ceremonial expertise for funeral occasions. These mourners, often women, were skilled in the traditional lamentations, gestures, and behaviors expected at funerals, ensuring that proper mourning customs were observed regardless of the family's personal emotional state or cultural knowledge. Musicians specializing in funeral music emerged as another important professional group, providing both liturgical and secular musical accompaniment for funeral ceremonies. These musicians were skilled in the specific repertoire appropriate for different types of funerals and could adapt their performances to match the social status and religious preferences of the deceased's family. Cemetery workers developed specialized skills in grave preparation, body handling, and burial procedures, becoming essential participants in the funeral process. These workers often formed guild-like organizations that regulated their profession and maintained standards for their services. Monument makers and tomb sculptors emerged as highly skilled craftsmen who served wealthy families seeking permanent memorialization for their deceased relatives. These artisans developed sophisticated techniques for creating stone sculptures, brass memorials, and other commemorative objects that required both artistic skill and technical expertise. The development of funeral directing as a profession brought together various specialized services under unified management, allowing families to coordinate complex funeral arrangements through a single professional contact. This development reflected the increasing complexity of medieval funeral practices and the growing commercialization of death-related services. Funeral endowments and institutions. The medieval practice of establishing funeral endowments created permanent institutions dedicated to providing ongoing spiritual assistance for the deceased. These endowments represented significant economic commitments that could involve substantial portions of family wealth and had lasting impacts on medieval religious and economic institutions. Chantry chapels, established through individual or family endowments, provided permanent locations for masses and prayers for the deceased. These institutions required ongoing economic support to maintain clergy, building upkeep, and liturgical supplies, creating long-term economic relationships between families and religious institutions. Hospital and charitable institutions often benefited from funeral bequests, with dying individuals leaving portions of their estates to support institutions that cared for the poor, sick, or dying. These bequests reflected medieval Christian values while creating important sources of funding for charitable institutions. Monastic communities received significant support through funeral-related donations, with families providing endowments in exchange for ongoing prayers and memorial services for deceased relatives. These arrangements created complex economic relationships between monastic communities and lay families that could continue for generations. The practice of anniversary masses, where families established endowments to provide annual memorial services for deceased relatives, created ongoing economic obligations that could continue for centuries. These arrangements required careful legal documentation and institutional management to ensure their proper execution over time. Guild funeral benefits provided collective approaches to funeral economics, with members contributing to common funds that supported funeral arrangements for all members. These collective arrangements reflected medieval values of mutual support while addressing practical economic challenges faced by individual families. The late medieval period, 1300 to 1500 CE, The Black Death and changing attitudes. The devastating impact of the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, fundamentally transformed medieval attitudes toward death and funeral practices throughout Europe. The unprecedented mortality rates, estimated to have killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, created new challenges for traditional funeral customs and forced adaptations that would influence death culture for centuries to come. The sheer scale of mortality during the plague years overwhelmed traditional funeral arrangements, forcing communities to develop mass burial procedures that departed dramatically from customary individual funeral practices. The use of plague pits, where dozens or hundreds of bodies were buried together, represented a radical departure from traditional Christian burial customs that emphasized individual graves and proper funeral rites. The shortage of clergy during the plague period created new problems for funeral arrangements, as many priests died from the disease, leaving insufficient numbers to perform the extensive funeral rites that had become customary. This shortage led to simplified funeral procedures and increased lay participation in death-related rituals, changes that permanently altered the relationship between clergy and laity in funeral practices. The psychological impact of the plague created new artistic and literary expressions of death that influenced medieval death culture. The development of the ars moriendi, art of dying, literature provided practical guidance for preparing for death and managing the dying process, reflecting increased anxiety about death and salvation in the post-plague period. The growth of vernacular literature about death and dying created new cultural resources for understanding and managing death-related experiences. These literary works provided models for proper death behavior, funeral arrangements, and memorial practices that influenced expectations and standards throughout medieval society. Women and funeral practices. Women's roles in death care. Throughout the medieval period, women played crucial but often overlooked roles in death care and funeral practices, serving as primary caregivers for the dying, preparers of the dead, and maintainers of memorial traditions. These roles reflected broader gender expectations while creating distinctive spheres of feminine expertise and authority in death-related activities. Women traditionally served as primary caregivers during illness and the dying process, providing both physical care and spiritual comfort for dying family members and community members. This caregiving role gave women intimate knowledge of death processes and special authority in managing the practical aspects of death preparation and funeral arrangements. The preparation of bodies for burial was typically women's work, requiring specialized knowledge of washing, dressing, and preserving corpses according to religious and social requirements. Women developed expertise in the practical skills necessary for body preparation while maintaining the appropriate religious and cultural protocols for handling the dead. Women often served as professional mourners, providing specialized emotional expression and ceremonial expertise for funeral occasions. These women were skilled in traditional lamentations, mourning songs, and ritual behaviors that were considered essential for proper funeral observance, making them important participants in community funeral practices. The role of women in maintaining household and family memorial traditions created ongoing responsibilities that extended far beyond the immediate funeral period. Women often supervised anniversary masses, maintained family burial sites, and preserved family memorial objects, making them crucial figures in the long-term commemoration of the dead. Religious women, including nuns and female members of religious communities, developed distinctive approaches to death and funeral practices that combined traditional feminine caring roles with specialized religious knowledge and authority. Convents often served as important centers for death care and funeral services, particularly for women and children. Female religious communities. Medieval convents and female religious communities developed sophisticated approaches to death and funeral practices that reflected their spiritual values, community structure, and gender-specific concerns. These communities created distinctive traditions that influenced broader medieval death culture while serving the specific needs of religious women. Monastic funeral practices for nuns emphasized spiritual equality and community solidarity, with elaborate rituals designed to honor the deceased's religious commitment while providing comfort and support for the surviving community members. These funeral arrangements often included special ceremonies recognizing the deceased's spiritual achievements and service to the community. The practice of preparing nuns for death included distinctive elements such as special prayers, community presence during the dying process, and ceremonies designed to celebrate the transition from earthly to eternal religious life. These practices created models for religious death preparation that influenced lay funeral customs. Female religious communities often maintained elaborate memorial traditions that included ongoing prayers, anniversary celebrations, and maintenance of community burial grounds. These memorial practices created institutional memory that could continue for centuries and provided models for lay memorial activities. The role of abbesses and other female religious leaders in death-related activities created spheres of feminine authority and expertise that were respected throughout medieval society. These women developed specialized knowledge about death care, funeral arrangements, and memorial practices that made them important advisors for lay families seeking proper funeral arrangements. Convents often served as important centers for death care and funeral services for the broader community, particularly for women and children who might not have access to other specialized death care services. These institutions provided both practical services and spiritual expertise that made them valuable resources for community funeral needs. Widowhood and memorial responsibilities. Medieval widowhood created distinctive roles and responsibilities related to memorial and funeral practices, as widows became primary custodians of their deceased husband's memory while managing their own preparation for death. The experience of widowhood was shaped by social expectations, economic circumstances, and religious beliefs about marriage, death, and memorial obligations. Widows bore primary responsibility for maintaining their husband's memorial arrangements, including supervising anniversary masses, maintaining tomb sites, and preserving family memorial objects. These responsibilities required ongoing economic commitments and social connections that could continue for decades after their husbands' deaths. The social status of widows in medieval society created complex relationships with funeral and memorial practices, as widows often gained new economic and social independence while bearing increased memorial responsibilities. Wealthy widows could commission elaborate memorial projects, while poor widows might struggle to maintain basic memorial obligations. The practice of widow remarriage created complications for memorial obligations, as new marriages could conflict with ongoing commitments to previous husbands' memorial needs. Medieval society developed complex customs and legal arrangements to address these conflicts while maintaining appropriate memorial practices. Widows often played important roles in preparing other women for death and managing women's funerals within their communities, drawing on their personal experience with death and loss to provide expertise and comfort for other bereaved families. This role made widows important figures in community death culture. The preparation of widows for their own deaths often involved complex arrangements that needed to balance their memorial obligations to deceased husbands with their own funeral preferences and family relationships. These arrangements required careful planning and could involve negotiations with multiple family groups and religious institutions. Children and funeral practices. Infant and child mortality. Medieval Europe experienced extraordinarily high rates of infant and child mortality, with estimates suggesting that 30 to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood. This demographic reality profoundly shaped medieval attitudes toward childhood death and created distinctive funeral practices that reflected both grief for lost children and theological concerns about infant salvation. The high frequency of infant death created practical and emotional challenges for medieval families, who needed to develop coping mechanisms for repeated experiences of child loss while maintaining hope for surviving children. These experiences influenced family funeral practices by creating expectations for simple, frequent funeral arrangements that could be managed within limited family resources. Theological questions about infant salvation created complex religious issues that influenced funeral practices for young children. The development of the doctrine of limbo provided a theological solution for unbaptized infants while creating different funeral arrangements for baptized versus unbaptized children. The practice of emergency baptism for dying infants became an important element of medieval death culture, with families, midwives, and clergy developing procedures for ensuring baptism even when formal church ceremonies were impossible. These practices influenced funeral arrangements by creating different ritual requirements for children who had received various forms of baptism. Medieval artistic representations of child death, including tomb sculptures, memorial paintings, and literary works, reveal sophisticated emotional responses to child mortality that combined grief with religious resignation. These artistic works provide important evidence about medieval attitudes toward childhood and death that influenced broader funeral practices. Childhood funeral customs. Medieval funeral customs for children developed distinctive characteristics that reflected both the special status of childhood innocence and practical considerations related to child mortality rates. These customs created alternative funeral arrangements that differed significantly from adult funeral practices while maintaining important religious and social functions. The practice of burying children in special cemetery sections or in proximity to church buildings reflected beliefs about childhood innocence and the special status of children in Christian salvation. These burial arrangements created distinctive childhood memorial landscapes that served both practical and spiritual functions. Children's funeral processions often included special elements such as white clothing, flower decorations, and participation by other children, creating distinctively childlike ceremonial arrangements that celebrated innocence while acknowledging loss. These processions served important community functions by involving other families with children and providing public recognition of childhood loss. The practice of creating child-specific memorial objects, including small tomb sculptures, memorial paintings, and special funeral clothing, reflected both parental love and broader social recognition of childhood as a distinctive life stage deserving special commemorative attention. Medieval children's funeral songs and prayers developed distinctive content that emphasized themes of innocence, angelic intervention, and parental comfort, creating specialized liturgical and cultural resources for managing childhood death. These specialized resources provided both spiritual comfort and practical guidance for families experiencing child loss. The involvement of godparents and extended family networks in children's funerals created broader community participation that provided support for bereaved parents while reinforcing social bonds and shared responsibility for child welfare. These community arrangements reflected medieval values about collective responsibility for children's spiritual and physical welfare. Jewish and Islamic funeral practices in medieval Europe. Jewish communities and burial customs. Jewish communities in medieval Europe maintained distinctive funeral practices that reflected both religious requirements and adaptation to Christian-dominated societies. These communities developed sophisticated burial customs that preserved Jewish identity while navigating complex relationships with Christian neighbors and authorities. Jewish funeral practices emphasized rapid burial, typically within 24 hours of death, reflecting religious requirements about respect for the dead and concern for ritual purity. This practice often created conflicts with Christian authorities who expected longer funeral arrangements and more elaborate ceremonial displays. The Jewish practice of ritual washing, tahara, and shrouding the dead created distinctive funeral preparation procedures that required specialized knowledge and community participation. Jewish communities developed organized burial societies, chevra kadisha, that maintained expertise in these ritual requirements while providing community support for bereaved families. Jewish cemetery arrangements reflected both religious requirements and social pressures from Christian authorities. Jewish communities typically maintained separate cemeteries that allowed for proper religious burial practices while acknowledging their minority status within Christian societies. The Jewish emphasis on mourning periods, Shiva, Shalashim, created distinctive temporal structures for grief and memorial activities that differed from Christian practices while serving similar functions of community support and gradual reintegration of bereaved individuals into normal social activities. Jewish memorial practices, including annual memorial observances, Yarzeit, and ongoing prayers for the dead, Kaddish, created permanent institutional arrangements for remembering the deceased that reflected Jewish theological concerns while adapting to medieval European social conditions. Islamic funeral traditions. Islamic communities in medieval Europe, particularly in Iberia during the period of Muslim rule, maintained distinctive funeral practices that reflected Islamic religious requirements while adapting to European social and political conditions. These practices created alternative models for death care and memorial activities that influenced broader medieval death culture. Islamic funeral practices emphasized simplicity and rapid burial, with bodies typically interred within 24 hours of death after appropriate ritual washing and shrouding. These practices reflected Islamic theological concerns about the temporary nature of earthly life and the importance of proper spiritual preparation for the afterlife. Monastic scriptoriums produced important funeral-related literature, including liturgical books, prayer collections, and theological works about death and the afterlife, creating intellectual resources that influenced broader medieval death culture and funeral practices. The development of monastic obituary books and memorial records created systematic approaches to remembering the dead that provided models for secular memorial practices while ensuring ongoing monastic prayers and memorial activities for deceased benefactors. Monastic communities often maintained guest facilities and death care services for pilgrims and travelers, creating networks of funeral support that served medieval Europe's mobile population while demonstrating monastic hospitality and spiritual service. Papal and conciliar legislation. The medieval period witnessed extensive papal and conciliar legislation regarding funeral practices, as church authorities sought to standardize death-related customs, control popular religious practices, and ensure proper theological understanding of death and the afterlife. This legislation created comprehensive frameworks for funeral regulation that influenced practices throughout medieval Europe. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, established important precedents for church control over funeral practices, including requirements for annual confession, standardized procedures for last rites, and regulations governing burial practices that created uniform expectations for Christian death preparation. Papal decrees regarding purgatory, indulgences, and prayers for the dead established theological frameworks that influenced funeral practices by creating official church teaching about the effectiveness of various memorial activities and spiritual assistance for deceased individuals. Conciliar legislation regarding funeral fees, clerical obligations, and burial rites created legal frameworks that regulated the economic aspects of funeral practices while ensuring church revenue from death-related services and protecting clerical interests in funeral arrangements. The development of canon law regarding Christian burial, cemetery consecration, and memorial practices created comprehensive legal systems that governed all aspects of death and burial, giving church courts jurisdiction over funeral disputes and memorial conflicts. Papal and conciliar condemnations of excessive funeral display, superstitious practices, and inappropriate memorial customs demonstrated church concern about popular funeral culture while attempting to maintain clerical authority over death-related activities and theological interpretation. Death and salvation. Theological frameworks. Purgatory and memorial prayers. The medieval development of purgatory as a theological concept revolutionized Christian funeral practices by creating new possibilities for ongoing spiritual assistance to the deceased through prayer, mass offerings, and good works performed by the living. This doctrine transformed funerals from primarily commemorative events into active interventions on behalf of the deceased's eternal welfare. The theological elaboration of purgatory created complex systems for calculating the spiritual benefit of various memorial activities, including different types of masses, prayer cycles, and charitable works that could be offered for deceased individuals. These calculations influenced funeral planning by encouraging families to invest significant resources in ongoing spiritual assistance. The practice of establishing perpetual memorial endowments, where families provided ongoing financial support for masses and prayers for deceased relatives, created permanent institutional relationships between families and religious communities that could continue for centuries while ensuring ongoing spiritual assistance for the dead. The development of indulgence systems, where specific spiritual benefits could be obtained through particular religious activities or financial contributions, influenced funeral practices by creating new opportunities for spiritual assistance while generating important revenue for church institutions. The medieval emphasis on the communion of saints, which described ongoing spiritual relationships between the living and dead, provided theological justification for elaborate memorial practices while creating expectations for ongoing family responsibilities toward deceased relatives. The theological controversy over the effectiveness of prayers for the dead, particularly regarding the immediate versus gradual nature of spiritual assistance, influenced funeral practices by creating competing approaches to memorial activities and different institutional arrangements for ongoing spiritual care. Last rites and deathbed practices. The medieval development of last rites as essential sacramental preparation for death created standardized procedures that needed to be completed before an individual could receive proper Christian burial, giving clergy crucial roles in death preparation while ensuring church control over the dying process. The practice of extreme unction, anointing with holy oil, became an essential element of deathbed preparation that required clerical participation and created religious significance for the dying process beyond simple medical or family care. This sacramental requirement ensured clerical involvement in death preparation while providing spiritual comfort for dying individuals and their families. The requirement for final confession and communion created deathbed procedures that needed careful timing and coordination between family members, clergy, and medical caregivers, making death preparation a complex process that required both spiritual and practical expertise. The development of elaborate deathbed ceremonies, including special prayers, biblical readings, and ritualized actions, created formal procedures for managing the dying process that served both spiritual and social functions by providing structured approaches to otherwise chaotic and emotionally difficult experiences. The practice of gathering witnesses for deathbed scenes created social obligations that brought together family members, friends, and community representatives to observe and validate proper death preparation, making death a community event rather than purely private family concern. The medieval emphasis on conscious death preparation, where individuals needed to maintain awareness and spiritual focus during the dying process, created cultural expectations about proper dying behavior that influenced both individual death preparation and family funeral arrangements. Concepts of afterlife and memorial. Medieval Christian concepts of the afterlife created complex theological frameworks that influenced funeral practices by establishing different spiritual destinations and ongoing relationships between the living and dead. These concepts evolved throughout the medieval period, creating changing expectations for funeral arrangements and memorial activities. The development of detailed descriptions of heaven, hell, and purgatory created specific spiritual geography that influenced memorial practices by establishing clear spiritual destinations that could be affected by earthly actions and ongoing spiritual assistance from living relatives and religious communities. The medieval emphasis on particular judgment immediately after death versus general judgment at the end of time created temporal frameworks for understanding death and afterlife that influenced the timing and duration of memorial activities while establishing ongoing spiritual relationships between the living and dead. The concept of the resurrection of the body provided theological justification for the Christian preference for burial over cremation while creating expectations about the preservation and treatment of corpses that influenced funeral preparation and cemetery practices throughout the medieval period. The development of sophisticated concepts about the beatific vision and eternal spiritual rewards created aspirational frameworks that influenced funeral practices by encouraging elaborate memorial arrangements designed to assist deceased individuals in achieving ultimate spiritual fulfillment. The medieval understanding of intercession, where saints and deceased individuals could provide spiritual assistance for living persons, created reciprocal spiritual relationships that justified ongoing memorial activities while providing comfort and practical benefits for bereaved families and communities. Art, literature, and cultural expression. Tomb art and sculpture. Medieval tomb art and sculpture underwent dramatic evolution throughout the period, developing from simple grave markers into sophisticated artistic productions that combined religious devotion, personal commemoration, and artistic achievement. These artistic developments reflected changing attitudes toward individual identity, death, and memorial while creating lasting cultural monuments that influenced broader medieval artistic culture. Early medieval tomb sculpture typically featured simple geometric or symbolic designs that emphasized religious rather than individual themes, reflecting theological concerns about the temporary nature of earthly identity and the universal character of Christian salvation. These early monuments established artistic traditions that would evolve throughout the medieval period. The development of effigy sculpture during the High Medieval period created new possibilities for individual commemoration that emphasized personal identity, social status, and individual achievement while maintaining appropriate religious symbolism and theological content. These effigies required skilled sculptors and represented significant artistic patronage that influenced regional artistic development. The evolution toward realistic portraiture in late medieval tomb sculpture reflected changing attitudes toward individual identity and artistic representation that emphasized personal characteristics and individual achievement rather than generic social or religious categories. This artistic development created new standards for memorial art that influenced broader cultural attitudes toward death and commemoration. The development of elaborate architectural settings for tomb sculptures, including canopies, side panels, and integrated decorative programs, created complex artistic environments that combined sculptural, architectural, and decorative arts into comprehensive memorial productions that demonstrated both artistic sophistication and family wealth. The practice of creating tomb sculptures during the subject's lifetime, allowing for accurate portraiture and personal input into the memorial design, reflected changing attitudes toward death preparation and individual control over memorial arrangements while creating new opportunities for artistic collaboration and personal expression. Literary representations of death. Medieval literature developed sophisticated approaches to death, dying, and memorial that reflected changing cultural attitudes while providing artistic frameworks for understanding and managing death-related experiences. These literary developments influenced broader medieval death culture by providing models for proper death behavior, funeral arrangements, and memorial practices. The development of hagiographical literature, which described the deaths of saints and holy individuals, provided models for proper Christian dying that influenced both individual death preparation and community expectations about death behavior. These literary works established cultural standards that shaped funeral practices throughout medieval Europe. The emergence of vernacular death literature, including poems, songs, and narrative works that addressed death themes in local languages, created accessible cultural resources that influenced popular death culture while providing alternatives to purely ecclesiastical approaches to death and memorial. The development of allegorical death literature, including works like The Dance of Death, tradition and morality plays featuring death personifications, created artistic frameworks for understanding death's universal nature while providing entertainment and moral instruction for medieval audiences. The medieval tradition of death poetry, including elegies, laments, and commemorative verses, provided artistic expressions of grief and loss that served both individual emotional needs and broader cultural functions by preserving memory and providing models for appropriate mourning behavior. The development of biographical and autobiographical literature that addressed death experiences, including accounts of death preparation, funeral arrangements, and memorial activities, provided documentary evidence about medieval death culture while creating literary precedents for personal death reflection. Musical traditions and funeral music. Medieval funeral music developed distinctive traditions that served both liturgical and cultural functions, creating artistic expressions that provided spiritual comfort, community participation, and aesthetic enhancement for funeral ceremonies. These musical developments reflected broader medieval musical evolution while serving specific death-related functions. The development of Gregorian chant traditions specific to funeral liturgy created standardized musical frameworks for funeral ceremonies that provided both spiritual significance and artistic beauty while ensuring appropriate religious content for funeral observances throughout medieval Europe. The emergence of polyphonic funeral music during the later medieval period created new opportunities for artistic sophistication in funeral ceremonies while demonstrating the musical expertise of religious communities and the cultural sophistication of families that could afford elaborate musical arrangements. The development of vernacular funeral songs and laments provided alternatives to purely liturgical musical expressions while serving important emotional and cultural functions for community members who needed accessible musical frameworks for expressing grief and commemorating deceased individuals. The practice of incorporating secular musical elements into funeral ceremonies, including instrumental music and non-liturgical songs, created hybrid musical arrangements that served both religious and cultural functions while reflecting the complex relationship between sacred and secular culture in medieval society. The development of specialized funeral music for different social groups, including noble funeral music, guild funeral songs, and confraternal musical traditions, created distinctive musical expressions that reinforced social identity while serving memorial functions for specific community groups. Technology and innovation in funeral practices. Embalming and body preservation. While sophisticated embalming techniques would not become common in Europe until later periods, medieval funeral practices included various approaches to body preservation that reflected both practical necessities and religious beliefs about bodily integrity and resurrection. These preservation techniques evolved throughout the medieval period in response to changing social needs and technological capabilities. Early medieval body preservation typically relied on natural methods including rapid burial, seasonal timing, and simple preservation materials such as salt, herbs, and aromatic substances that could slow decomposition while maintaining religious appropriateness and cultural acceptability. The practice of evisceration for high-status individuals, particularly during extended funeral arrangements or when bodies needed to be transported over long distances, represented one of the most sophisticated medieval approaches to body preservation while creating complex religious and cultural questions about bodily integrity. The development of specialized materials for body wrapping and preservation, including treated cloths, aromatic substances, and protective containers, reflected growing technical expertise and increased demand for body preservation services among wealthy families seeking elaborate funeral arrangements. The medieval understanding of putrefaction and decomposition, based on classical medical theory and practical experience, influenced preservation techniques while creating cultural attitudes toward death and bodily decay that affected funeral timing, cemetery practices, and memorial arrangements. The practice of heart burial, where the heart was removed and buried separately from the body, represented both a preservation technique and a distinctive memorial practice that allowed for multiple burial sites while reflecting medieval understanding of the heart's spiritual significance. Transportation and logistics. Medieval funeral practices required increasingly sophisticated transportation and logistical arrangements, particularly for high-status individuals whose funeral ceremonies might involve multiple locations, extended ceremonies, and large numbers of participants. These logistical challenges stimulated innovations in funeral management and transportation techniques. The development of specialized funeral transportation, including decorated wagons, ceremonial litters, and funeral ships, created distinctive vehicles designed specifically for moving deceased individuals while providing appropriate ceremonial dignity and practical functionality for funeral processions. The practice of multi-location funeral ceremonies, where bodies might be displayed in several different churches or communities before final burial, required careful coordination of transportation, preservation, and ceremonial arrangements that demanded professional expertise and sophisticated planning. The logistics of large funeral processions, which could involve hundreds of participants traveling significant distances, required careful organization of accommodations, food, transportation, and ceremonial supplies that created important economic activity and professional specialization in funeral management. The development of funeral communication networks, where news of deaths and funeral arrangements needed to be transmitted quickly over long distances, created informal systems of communication that served both practical and social functions while connecting distant communities and family networks. The practice of seasonal funeral scheduling, where families might delay funeral ceremonies to accommodate travel conditions, weather patterns, or religious calendar requirements, created complex temporal arrangements that required flexible planning and sophisticated coordination of multiple factors. Cemetery development and management. Medieval cemetery development evolved from simple community burial grounds into sophisticated managed landscapes that required ongoing maintenance, careful organization, and professional expertise. This evolution reflected changing attitudes toward death commemoration while creating new technological and administrative challenges. The development of cemetery layout principles, including considerations of drainage, soil conditions, and spatial organization, required practical expertise that led to the emergence of specialized cemetery design and management professionals who understood both practical and religious requirements for burial grounds. The practice of cemetery consecration created religious requirements for burial ground preparation that needed to be coordinated with practical considerations about location, accessibility, and ongoing maintenance while ensuring appropriate spiritual significance for burial activities. The development of cemetery record-keeping systems, including burial registers, plot assignments, and memorial documentation, created administrative frameworks that required literacy, organizational skills, and institutional continuity while serving important legal and memorial functions. The emergence of cemetery maintenance as a specialized occupation created professional expertise in ground care, monument preservation, and ongoing cemetery management that served both practical and aesthetic functions while ensuring appropriate dignity for burial environments. The development of cemetery expansion and reorganization procedures, necessary as urban populations grew and burial needs changed, required sophisticated planning and administration while addressing sensitive cultural and religious concerns about disturbing existing burials. The end of the medieval period. The transition from medieval to early modern funeral practices occurred gradually throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, influenced by religious reformation, humanist thought, technological innovation, and changing social structures. This transition transformed medieval funeral culture while preserving many elements that would continue to influence European death practices for centuries to come. The Protestant Reformation created fundamental challenges to medieval funeral practices by questioning theological assumptions about purgatory, intercession, and the efficacy of prayers for the dead. Protestant funeral practices emphasize divine grace and predestination while rejecting elaborate memorial arrangements designed to assist deceased souls through purgatorial purification. The development of Renaissance humanism influenced funeral practices by emphasizing individual achievement, artistic expression, and classical cultural models rather than purely religious concerns about salvation and eternal life. Humanist funeral practices created new artistic and literary expressions while maintaining basic Christian theological frameworks. The growth of print culture during the late medieval and early modern periods transformed funeral practices by making death-related literature, liturgical materials, and funeral guidance widely available while standardizing funeral procedures and creating shared cultural resources for managing death experiences. The emergence of early modern state power created new secular authorities that competed with church control over funeral practices while establishing civil requirements for death registration, cemetery management, and funeral regulation that would eventually transform medieval ecclesiastical control over death culture. The development of global trade and cultural exchange during the early modern period introduced new funeral practices, materials, and cultural influences that challenged medieval European funeral traditions while creating opportunities for cultural innovation and adaptation. Continuing influences. Many elements of medieval funeral practices continued to influence European death culture long after the medieval period ended, creating enduring traditions that adapted to changing social conditions while maintaining basic cultural and religious significance. These continuing influences demonstrate the lasting impact of medieval death culture on subsequent European civilization. The Christian preference for burial over cremation, established during the early medieval period, continued to dominate European funeral practices well into the modern period, reflecting medieval theological concerns about bodily resurrection while adapting to changing cultural and practical circumstances. The practice of elaborate funeral ceremonies for high-status individuals, developed during the medieval period, continued to influence state funerals, military ceremonies, and other public death observances that maintained medieval traditions of ceremonial display while adapting to modern political and cultural requirements. The medieval development of permanent cemeteries, memorial monuments, and ongoing memorial practices established cultural patterns that continued to influence European death culture while adapting to changing urban conditions, religious practices, and artistic styles. The medieval emphasis on community participation in funeral activities, including religious services, ceremonial processions, and ongoing memorial observances, created cultural expectations about collective responsibility for death care that continued to influence European funeral practices despite changing social structures. The medieval integration of death preparation into daily life, including religious practices, artistic expression, and cultural education, established approaches to death awareness that influenced European culture while adapting to changing religious beliefs, medical knowledge, and social conditions. Historical significance. The study of medieval funeral practices reveals fundamental aspects of medieval European civilization while providing insights into universal human experiences of mortality, grief, and memorial. This historical investigation demonstrates the complex relationships between religious belief, social organization, economic resources, and cultural expression that characterized medieval society. Medieval funeral practices provide important evidence about social stratification, economic relationships, and power structures in medieval society by revealing how resources were allocated for death-related activities and how social hierarchies were maintained and challenged through funeral arrangements. The evolution of medieval funeral practices demonstrates the dynamic nature of medieval culture while revealing how traditional customs adapted to changing theological understanding, social conditions, and cultural influences throughout the medieval period. The comparative study of medieval funeral practices across different regions, religious communities, and social groups reveals both universal elements of human death culture and distinctive cultural variations that reflected local conditions, religious beliefs, and social structures. The artistic and literary achievements of medieval funeral culture represent important contributions to European cultural heritage while demonstrating the creative potential of death-related artistic expression and the importance of memorial art in medieval cultural production. The institutional developments associated with medieval funeral practices, including cemetery management, funeral service professions, and memorial endowments, created organizational precedents that influenced subsequent European institutional development while serving important social functions. Medieval funeral history ultimately reveals the human capacity for creating meaning, beauty, and social connection in confronting mortality while demonstrating how death culture serves essential functions in maintaining social cohesion, cultural continuity, and individual psychological well-being across historical periods and cultural contexts. The legacy of medieval funeral practices continues to influence contemporary approaches to death, memorial, and grief while providing historical perspective on enduring human concerns about mortality, memory, and transcendence. This comprehensive examination of medieval funeral practices demonstrates their central importance in medieval European civilization while revealing their ongoing influence on subsequent cultural development. The study of medieval death culture provides essential insights into both historical societies and universal human experiences that transcend particular historical periods while maintaining distinctive cultural characteristics that reflect specific social, religious, and cultural conditions. The rich complexity of medieval funeral practices reveals the sophisticated cultural achievement of medieval European civilization while providing enduring contributions to human understanding of death, memory, and the meaning of human existence.